Right. So I'll say that again then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, just to say, it's lovely to be back, and just to say thank you very much indeed for your best wishes. And I've been put back together again at Heartlands, and just a little plug for Heartlands. I didn't want to go there. I had heard not very encouraging things about Heartlands Hospital, but I must say the care there was absolutely fantastic, and the staff were lovely, and the care was good, and it was I won't say a pleasurable experience, but it certainly wasn't as awful as I've been thinking it might be when they said they were taking me to Heartlands. And yes,
I'm walking like a good one.
I've been put back together again, but I'm now quite scared about doing anything. I feel a bit like an egg that might fall over and break.
Humpty Dumpty.
I'm having to really make an effort to do my exercises, but I am being a good girl and doing them, because I've got physiotherapists questioning how many exercises I've done every day. Right, the reign of William I. We're onto very familiar ground now, I think. A lot of the school syllabuses or syllabi start now with 1066, and certainly when we were at school, I think maybe that's how we started off when we went to secondary school. That is a popular date, 1066, a good way to start. And so the poor Anglo-Saxons get left out altogether, as we've said before. So the reign of William I, the beginning of the Norman dynasty. A very unusual character, has to be said, unusual in many ways. He was born in 1028 in Falaise in Normandy, and he had a brother. His father was Robert, Duke of Normandy. His mother, on the other hand, was what we now call working class. So a strange family to be born into. His mother had two names which don't sound very similar at all. Eleva, or Heleva, also known as Arlette, which sounds more French, and we can perhaps remember that one better. And she was the daughter of a tanner, which is why I said working class. And I've used the word concubine to describe her, because she wasn't just a passing fancy. She wasn't a one-night stand or anything like that, and she wasn't a prostitute. Been quite a lot of research into Arlette and her background, because obviously from William's point of view, it was a disadvantage that his parents weren't married, and it was used as a stick to beat him with for the rest of his life. It was used, the fact that he was illegitimate, was used against him on many occasions. He was very sensitive about the fact that his parents weren't married. But she wasn't quite what it appears. It wasn't that the Duke Robert I of Normandy had sort of picked her up in the street or anything like that, or she had status as his we'd say partner today. We'd say partner. They used to say mistress. So she did have some status. And we know this because, of course, later, a Norman Viscount was prepared to marry her. She wasn't a sort of disgraced woman. She married very well and had two more sons and a daughter. So a strange background for William, for the son, but one that he found embarrassing. It has to be said, in his later life, he found it very embarrassing that his parents were not married, and that his mother was the daughter of a tanner. That was used on many occasions against him. Another difficulty in his childhood was that his father died when William, was only 7. And we know now that that is a very awful thing for a child to cope with. And Robert died in a very honourable way, returning from a Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem. this family were noted for being very pious, very, very, by the standards of the day, good Christians. Going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem was a massive enterprise in those days because travel was difficult. It could take many, many months to reach the Middle East and cost a great deal of money because of transport problems, and that you had to hire transport animals every time you crossed the frontier, and pay tolls every time you came to certain roads and certain bridges. It cost a fortune to go to Jerusalem.
And you'd have no sat nav, so then how would they get there?
Martin said you would have no sat nav. How would they get there? Well, you had to pay for guides, of course.
Right.
And then, of course, you had to pay for your, you had to pay not just for the travel, but where were you going to stay? Well, luckily, right across Europe, there were places where pilgrims could stay, either free of charge, because the church opened its doors, the abbeys particularly had guest rooms, and there were also special places built to accommodate pilgrims. There's a lovely place in Canterbury, which you can visit, which was the accommodation for, I think it was 30 pilgrims, a bit like a motel today. But you still had, unless it was completely paid for by the charity, you were expected to make a contribution. And otherwise you had to pay, like you would today. You have to pay to stay in a hotel. So it was a very costly thing to do in terms of time and money and inconvenience. And because of the pilgrim routes being very popular, so was we now call them highwaymen, people that sort of brigands that pounced on these pilgrims and took the money that they were going to donate to the shrine when they got there. So he scored a lot of brownie points for dying while returning from a pilgrimage. He was assured of a place in heaven. Prior to his departure, he had done a very unusual thing. He'd actually made his henchmen, his noblemen in Normandy, swear an oath of allegiance to his 7-year-old son. Really strange thing to do. A 7-year-old and born out of wedlock. So this is a very strange situation. And the Norman noblemen actually accepted this, which is also strange. Or they appeared to accept it, which means that Robert had great powers of command and leadership. He obviously had the respect of these Norman henchmen, because otherwise, why would they have agreed to do such an unusual thing? Swear allegiance to a 7-year-old. And he also gained the approval and support of his overlord, the King of France, Henry I. So we know that William's father was a very persuasive, dominant character, qualities which his son inherited. So it's important to say that he had an unusual background, very unusual indeed, but that it served him well in the future. However, as you might expect, a 7-year-old in charge of a kingdom, there followed a time of absolute chaos and turmoil and civil war, all sorts of awful things happening. Private castles, that doesn't sound awful, private castles being built, but it meant that people were going against the rules. They weren't supposed to build private castles. Castles were supposed to be royal. And then they might put one of the noblemen in charge of the castle as a garrison. But individuals were not supposed to trot about building castles on their own, just deciding, because that would create a power base and meant that they could threaten the leadership, which of course is exactly what happened. Private wars broke out, and 3 of the appointed guardians for the little boy, for the little Duke, that died violent deaths. In other words, they were murdered. So a bit like a soap opera, awful things happening because the leader was a child. That was actually a passage in the Bible. Woe unto thee, O country, when that king is a child. You know, it's a recipe for disaster. Always has been. Don't have a child in charge. People will just take advantage. And that's exactly what happened in Normandy. Which makes it all the more surprising that this is what Duke Robert had done. But you know, this William was his son, and he loved him very much, and that's why he appointed him. His mother, Arlette, this woman who's historically treated with contempt as a woman who's no better than she should be, was absolutely magnificent. She not just supported her son, she organized, created a support group and protected her son amazingly well. And he came through with a very powerful will, that might have been genetic, and a very, very great hatred and abhorrence of unrest, lawlessness, misrule. It gave the boy a very powerful motive in putting down rebellions in the future. Rebellion, absolute anathema, because he'd experienced that in his youth, what chaos was caused by lawlessness and misrule, and powerful people all claiming that they should be the ruler or they should have power. When he was 15, and he was a very grown-up 15-year-old, he was knighted, and it was then considered time for him to take over personally. 15 seems incredibly young to us, but to take over his kingdom, his dukedom. But he obviously experienced many difficulties. He wanted justice. He wanted to punish the people who had caused such trouble. He wanted them identified and dealt with. It was never a case of let bygones be bygones. It was never a case of we'll forgive the people who were so difficult when I was a child. It was find out who they are, round them up, let's have them punished. He believed in justice. And that was a very, very strong motivation throughout his life. Find who they are, find the guilty men, or women, but mainly men, find out who they are and pay them back for what they did. It might have been many years ago, but we're not going to forget what they did. We're going to hunt them down and punish them, kill them. So he was respected, even though he was so young. He dealt with a whole series of baronial rebellions because many of the adults didn't respect a 15-year-old. Why would they? And again, his life was in danger, but he was able to rely on the King of France, his overlord. So we know that he must have, even as a 15-year-old, have a kind of an adult air about him, that he was able to command respect, which is very unusual for a 15-year-old. He commanded sufficient respect that he came through this. He wasn't murdered, he wasn't assassinated, he wasn't poisoned. All these things were very likely to happen. But he survived and came through this period with, as a seasoned warrior. That meant that he understood how to fight. Obviously, he'd been trained as a soldier, but he also had very good. He gained experience and skills, organizational and leadership. Very important leadership skills. He was impressive even as a teenager. I used to use this actually in teaching. It was quite useful to say, you know, this young man was only 15 when teaching 15-year-olds. So to challenge them to be very mature and adult, and it worked really well actually. to sort of praise them for what they were doing that was sensible and grown up, and challenge them if they were acting childishly and or not doing their homework or whatever. Quite useful to have a 15-year-old in history that commanded respect and was coping well with this huge amount of power that he'd inherited. Power and responsibility. Because a lot of 15-year-old boys don't have much sense of responsibility. So it worked really well, actually. And they started to settle down and sort of behave somewhat more maturely than most 15-year-olds, let's put it that way. So he gained many very important qualities: self-control, willingness to take calculated risks on campaign, a good war leader, willingness to engage in battles. In other words, not cowardly, not timid, not cautious, not overcautious, willing to take risks when he'd considered all the options. He wasn't foolish or impulsive. He considered the options, but then was willing to take a calculated risk. And he kept plans simple so that his men could understand, and he explained to his men what the battle plan was. And that was quite unusual. That was quite really very unusual in those days. It was usually somebody decided what was going to happen, and the foot soldiers just didn't know what was going to happen, but just followed the leader and left in the dark, really. And that happens in modern warfare. People led into battle and they don't quite know what the plan is or what's going to happen if the battle, if they lose the battle, where they're going to go, what they're going to do. He was good at explaining and sharing his ideas. And he never lost sight of the lost ducal rights. He wanted to win his full power and full authority. But above all, he's very interested in money. He wanted the revenue back that he lost during the years of anarchy. And he was supremely self-confident. Very important. He believed in himself, to use a modern phrase, a rather American idea. He believed in himself. He had very healthy self-esteem. So moving on to how did he succeed, or was he successful as ruler of Normandy? Yes, he was. Now we come to an interesting aspect of his personality and his character, always described as very pious, as his father had been, dying on returning from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He couldn't be more pious than that, taking all those risks to go to Jerusalem. So William the Conqueror, William of Normandy, Duke William, was always described as very pious and a really good Christian. So what proof have we got of this? Well, he took the welfare of the church in Normandy very seriously. He had a half-brother. Arlette had married, as we said, married a very rich magnate, and one of the children was called Odo, which sounds like a deodorant or something. Bishop of Bayeux. He was appointed Bishop of Bayeux when he was only 16. So William was continuing the sort of family tradition of giving children responsibility, giving teenagers responsibility. And Odo became Bishop of Bayeux. There were undoubtedly lots of raised eyebrows and people saying, you've got to be joking. You can't have a bishop that's only 16 years old. Well, Bayeux did have a bishop that was only 16 years old, and he coped extremely well. And in fact, it was Odo that commissioned the tapestry. The famous Bayeux tapestry was commissioned by Odo to honour his half-brother. So Odo was an aristocrat by birth and a bishop by appointment. And William knew what he was doing. He knew he could trust his half-brother. There was a tremendous emphasis then on pious donations, people giving money to the church. And a lot of a kind of reform in the church, sort of checking up on people that they weren't misappropriating church funds, which was a good thing to do because some people were not very trustworthy. There were large amounts of money being donated to the church. Some of it went adrift. Some of it went into the pockets of individuals, rather like we're looking at situations today where we're wondering about some politicians. So that was very good. They were checking up on church finances and revenue, and an emphasis on pilgrimages, which of course William had inherited. He was proud of his father for having been on this pilgrimage to Jerusalem. That set the bar quite high, but pilgrimages were very much a thing to do. Most people didn't go as far as Jerusalem, but pilgrimages to Rome were very popular, and to shrines. People went quite great distances to visit shrines or burial places of saints or part of a saint. And William and his bishops held a lot of church councils, and William himself was there either as an observer or actually sort of like the chairman, leading the council and making rules, actually being proactive, particularly about simony, the selling of church offices, a form of corruption. Clerical marriages, much disapproved of. And William believed, like King Alfred had done, believed in taking advantage of the knowledge and the experience of clergy from other countries, other parts of Europe, other Christian countries, importing people with knowledge and understanding and people who'd written books. Considering he was such a proud man, that was interesting that he was very happy to welcome foreign scholars. Lanfranc of Pavia became abbot of Caen in 1063, and the king thought very highly of him, even though he was Italian. He wasn't French. And the king endowed many monasteries. I put several, but he endowed many monasteries, and was very concerned with monastic life, that the monks and nuns should set an example to others. And so there were investigations, we might say they were being Ofsteded rather regularly, which is a very modern idea, so in many ways he was a role model, an excellent role model, and a good Christian. But hold that thought. So what was it actually like? Now, Martin's apologized for not having found many illustrations, and it's certainly not Martin's fault at all. There aren't any pictures of him except, well, artist impressions, you might say. It's too early for accurate portraits, but there are descriptions of William, all of which agree that he was burly, he was tall, he was robust, and he had a guttural voice. It's interesting, probably shouting at people in battle, such as shouting battle orders. The only bit of his body to survive, interestingly, is his leg bone, his femur. We'll explain that at the end, why there is only that bit of him left. But even from the femur, scientists have worked out, don't quite know how, but anyway, they worked out that he was probably 5'10" tall, which is very exact from one bone. He enjoyed excellent health until his accident, which killed him. But in old age, he became extremely corpulent, fat, which he found embarrassing. He was described by Geoffrey Martel, a sort of journalist of the day, a chronicler, but they were like modern journalists, as being without equal as a fighter and a horseman, without equal. And Geoffrey Martel wasn't the kind of person who sort of handed out compliments in a generous way. So this was a very important statement, and obviously very sincerely held view about William. We don't know anything about his education. Some people have said he was illiterate. On the other hand, that clashes with something else that we know about him. In later life, he tried to learn to read Old English. Now, if he's trying to learn to read Old English in the old age, how come people have said he was illiterate? You wouldn't suddenly start wanting to read a foreign language in old age if you couldn't read your own language. So the idea that he was illiterate is not very convincing. We know his main hobby was hunting. That was true of many medieval kings, Norman and medieval, that they were crazy about hunting. And we know that he was the one that developed the forests and said that they were exclusive for royalty or for the nobility, that ordinary people couldn't go in the forests, or if they did, they had to have special permits and licenses, etc. And that he was the one that sort of developed what was called the New Forest, which is a very old forest, but it's new because it wasn't Saxon. He developed the New Forest. So hunting was what he enjoyed more than anything else, which also, of course, obviously involved, it's like practicing for warfare, being cunning, hunting down your prey, being on a horse all the time, throwing things at your enemy, throwing things at to kill the prey. You know, hunting was obviously a warlike activity. We know that he was very, very keen on money, which dated back to his childhood when things were so uncertain and money was being taken by these nobles, and you know, they weren't paying the taxes they should to the Duke of Normandy. They were stowing money away for themselves. So he was red hot when it came to money, a bit like an accountant, a bit like Henry VII, for a similar reason, an uncertain and somewhat erratic kind of childhood, very keen on money. A very happy marriage to Matilda of Flanders. And the legend, there are all sorts of stories about William the Conqueror. He's actually an interesting character. He attracted stories and legends, some of which we know were legends, and others we believe to be true. And the story goes that Matilda, when she was approached by by Duke William to ask her hand in marriage, was absolutely horrified because he was born out of wedlock. You know, beneath her, as far as she was concerned. She was noble born, and he was only half noble born. he didn't match her in rank, and so she told him she was too highborn to consider such a thing. And the legend or the story is that he then rode off and found Matilda on her way to church and dragged her off her horse using her plaits, which is so outrageous that it sounds true. It's a bit like that, would I lie to you? It sounds so unlikely that it probably happened, because why would somebody make up something so, yeah, Martin just said outlandish, knowing that he had a temper, knowing that he was very determined, knowing that he liked his own way and he did not like to be thwarted. It actually sounds true. And he humiliated her. He threw her down on the street in front of, here it says, her flabbergasted attendants. So they were extremely flabbergasted because they hadn't managed to protect her. You know, they were sort of security men, and they hadn't really done a very good job. But the story then goes that she was so impressed by this masterly and sort of macho behaviour, she then agreed to marry him. And it became a very solid, good marriage. The other interesting thing is that he was, for his day, very tall and wide and sort of chunky and burly and big. And she was very tiny and dainty, and her bones have been examined. Some people actually said she was a dwarf, or she certainly wasn't a dwarf, but she was tiny. She was like Queen Victoria, she was little. So when they were together, people have said they must have looked really quite extraordinary, that he was very tall for his time and she was very tiny. So another interesting fact about the royal couple. But what was amazing for those days was that he was totally faithful to her. Because a lot of men in those days sort of demonstrated their macho image by having mistresses. It was almost a given, accepted. It was almost as if they didn't have mistresses. People were wondering if there was something wrong with them. So it was, again, a sort of courageous thing that he did, bucking the trend, daring people to say, well, don't you say anything about me being faithful to one woman. That's my way of doing things. Confident in his own judgments, but willing to go against accepted wisdom or the accepted trends, because he was so self-confident. He knew best. So she was well born. Her father was the Count of Flanders, so he was marrying way out of his league. And certainly the king, amazingly, again, for those days, trusted her intelligence and actually left her as regent when he was away campaigning. And that was an enormous compliment to pay to a woman in those days, to leave her as regent. So again, he was able to think outside the box. He was able to sort of shock people by doing something unexpected, leaving her in charge. And she responded extremely well. There weren't any rebellions or anything while his back was turned. That would have been a risk in those days. People think, oh, yeah, we're going to take advantage of this. The cat's away, the mice will play. She died in 1083, and she had despite being so tiny, had 10 children. So he has certainly secured the succession. And the other interesting thing and lovely thing really about somebody that was so hard bitten and ruthless, we'll come to that in a minute, was that he was so distressed when his wife died that he went into what we now call a depression. There was a soft and gentle side to him. He was so absolutely devoted to his wife and absolutely distraught when she died. And again, willing to say that, willing to sort of show how distraught he was, which again was out of kilter with the accepted culture of the day, where men had to be very manly and not show emotion, not show emotion for women anyway. So then I've got interesting facts, stray facts, which I couldn't put under any particular heading. First of all, not usually emphasized, he was a Viking extraction. So it was like the Vikings had finally won through all those efforts to take over England that had failed. And now, sort of sneakily, the Vikings had won through because he was a Viking extraction. Though he spoke French, what's called Norman French, and born in Normandy, his ancestry was Norse. His great-great-grandfather was called Rollo, and he was a Viking pillager. Funny word, but a sort of invading but not intending to settle, just pillaging the land, stealing whatever was of value, and then disappearing. But eventually, like many of the Vikings, decided to settle down and take over because the land was so good. In exchange, a bit like the Danelaw, in exchange, you give land in exchange for agreeing not to attack anymore. We'll give you land and settle down, and that's what happened. Another fact about William, not surprisingly, he hated his nickname, which was William the Bastard. Nobody would want to be called that, but that was his nickname. As you know, people didn't have second names, they didn't have a dynastic name. The fashion was, and again, it was from the Vikings and the Saxons, they had a nickname, and that prevailed in other countries. And that was his name, it's like his second name, William the Bastard. And that's why, very obviously, he preferred to be known as William the Conqueror. He did not want to be known as William the Bastard, and for obvious reasons. People were punished for calling him William the Bastard. He carried on. I mean, people used it to mock him and oppose him. But the punishments were fairly awful. Well, very awful. I've already described about his wife not wanting anything to do with him when the alliance was first proposed. Again, owing to his base birth, she'd actually said, I would never be constrained to marry a bastard. And but then after this palaver with dragging her off her horse, she changed her mind. I mean, it is a very strange story, because you think if somebody had manhandled you off a horse using your hair, but the last man on earth you'd want to marry or have anything to do with. So he must have had unusual qualities of being attractive, being his powerful nature coming over as being attractive to women. He could not. Another good thing about him was that he couldn't bear any disrespect shown to his mother. He defended his mother, and it was her situation, the fact that she was a tanner's daughter, was used against William on many occasions by his enemies, used to sort of try and humiliate him and mock him. Not only was he born out of wedlock, his mother was a tanner's daughter. You know, how primitive is that? Tanning was a low kind of occupation because it was incredibly smelly. Because the tanners had to scrape the skin, the flesh off the skin before they could make anything. They had to do, it wasn't just a procedure. They got usually they had to take the skin off the animal. Sometimes that was done before and it was done for them, and the skin was arrived, but it was all horrible, and they had to scrape it, and it was a very smelly, horrible, seen as a very degraded sort of job, you know, the lowest jobs you could have. Although it was a skilled job, it was nasty and smelly, all of it, you know, curing the hides, etc., all involved nasty, smelly things. And so to be a tanner's daughter, so the Duke, later the King, was fierce in his defense of his mother. And he did a dreadful thing. He did many dreadful things during his life. And one of the really dreadful things he did was that people were mocking him in a town called Alençon in France. They were mocking him by hanging hides out of the windows and waving them and sort of jiggling them around and shouting things about being the grandson of a tanner. And he captured the city, the town, and then took his revenge by cutting their hands and feet off. At that point, your blood runs cold and think, what kind of a Christian could do that? What a dreadful thing to do. What an absolutely dreadful thing to even consider, but to go through with it. And yet, this contrast, this man who was pious, who went to church a lot, he went, you know, every opportunity. How could he have ordered such a thing, such a dreadful thing? I mean, most of them, of course, bled to death. But what a wicked thing to do. Another of the not characteristics, but another achievement, he made French the accepted language of the court when he conquered England. Absolutely no question of him learning Anglo-Saxon or compromising in any way, saying, well, I'd like you all to become bilingual, you know, you need to learn Norman French, but, you know, you also keep your... It was, right, we have taken over and everything important will now be in Norman French, like the language of the court, the law, the language of the law courts was changed to Norman French. If people didn't understand, well, then just better learn to speak Norman French. And anything to do with government, the word government itself, parliament from the word French parler, to talk. So the government language changed. So there were, it emphasized the fact that the Anglo-Saxons were a defeated people. They'd lost their language. No, they hadn't lost the language, they spoke the language, but everything important was now conducted in Norman French as a way of saying, you have been defeated, accept it. And it took many years for the language to sort of coalesce, and our language now, English, is a combination of Anglo-Saxon and Norman French and Latin and lots of other little bits and pieces that have come in over the centuries. But that took a long time. And there are still phrases in legal phrases which are Anglo-French or Latin. He was, a very interesting point, which I must have my dad didn't know anything about. William's jester, Taillefer, was the first casualty in the Battle of Hastings. As a sort of interesting, very trivial piece of information. I vaguely remember thinking it was funny to have a jester going into battle. I didn't know he got killed, but apparently it was to cheer everybody up. He was juggling and he was singing, and he was kind of the army's entertainer, and went into battle, led as a joke probably, was leading the army into battle, and mocking the Anglo-Saxons, mocking Harold's army, and promptly got shot. So he's the first casualty in the Battle of Hastings, which is interesting. He was taunting the English by juggling and probably shouting things, and got his comeuppance, was killed, and so became a sort of hero. We know the king was very touchy about his appearance. He'd probably been proud of being tall and very physically fit when he was young, because he was always on horseback, he was always campaigning. So he would have been fit, and it was known that he was, and he was big and strong. But this problem that developed that he was overweight, and he was corpulent, and he had this huge tummy. We don't know why, whether it was because he drank a lot of beer or whatever it was, but anyway, he was quite sensitive about it, but didn't do anything about it. Very touchy about his weight gain. And King Philip of France, who obviously had a sense of humour, but was sort of joking about the wrong person, probably hadn't worked out that William the Conqueror didn't seem to have much of a sense of humour. The King of France said that William looked like a woman full term, a pregnant woman full term, and asked when he was due. William did not fall about laughing and think, oh, what a lark. Isn't this entertaining and funny, and say something funny back. He was absolutely furious about it. I mean, he couldn't punish his overlord, he couldn't punish the King of France. But he then went on this weird and wonderful diet, which meant he didn't eat any food. He lived on beer and, wine and spirits, with the occasional drink of ale. We don't know how long this lasted, but he gave it up, which is not surprising. It doesn't sound very sensible at all. But he was absolutely furious about this insult. He took it very much to heart, this absolutely awful insult, and was very moody and very angry and bad-tempered for weeks and weeks and weeks after he'd been told this. He regarded it as an insult, which it was a very tactless thing to say, but he certainly didn't respond as the King of France had expected him to respond, in a light-hearted way. He didn't do light-hearted. So it was a great error of judgment on the part of the King of France to compare William with a pregnant woman. That was not a good idea. He is we probably do know this, he is the ancestor of our present royal family. Every British monarch that followed him was connected to him in some way. And also, interestingly, more than 25% of the current British population is related to him because he had so many children, and because the population was so small. I'm sure you've probably read this, that we are all related to royalty. Well, some people believe we are all related to royalty. If we could trace our family trees way, way back, because the population was so small and because some royal families were so huge, we're all related. So that could cheer us up when we're feeling a bit down. We're all actually got little bits of royal blood in us. And he's responsible for, interestingly, responsible for making the name William or Guillaume. I mean, he was called Guillaume, not William. William's the sort of anglicised version of his name, Guillaume. It became very popular indeed. By the 13th century, it was top name. There wasn't a very big pool of names, actually. You probably know from looking at burial lists or lists of tax returns, whatever. The pool of names was very limited compared with today, but William became top name for a time. And then it was John. And then it was Henry. You know, they took turns, but William became top name. Now, the very interesting thing, which you probably have learned and remembered, was what happened, how he died, and what happened at his funeral. How he died was as a consequence of being so heavy. It ended up killing him indirectly. But in fact, he was strong and healthy, even though he put all his weight on, because of his outdoor life. He had one of these people who could say, I haven't had a day's illness in my life. These annoying people who never had any illness at all. And we probably know people like that, or you might be like that. Never had a day's illness, not on any medication. So he was campaigning, as he usually was. He was, one important thing about William, he was very restless. Some people have wondered if he had ADHD. He was very restless. He hardly ever sat down. Well, he did sit down and feast, hence the weight gain. But he was always either hunting or campaigning or riding around his dukedom or later his kingdom. He didn't trust people. That was another aspect of his nature because of his background and because of his experiences as a young man. He didn't trust people. So he was very good at checking up, investigating, not leaving things to trust. He didn't trust the people that he'd rewarded. He promised them that if they would fight to help him to gain the crown of England, he would reward them with land and titles. And he kept his promise, as we know. But he kept it. We'll do this in more detail next time. He scattered their land around this country. He never gave them a large estate, pardon me, in one place. So that dealt with, that ticked two boxes. One, we're talking about the noblemen, the dukes, they would have to keep riding round the kingdom, checking on their estates. They would have to be on the move. He also told them to build castles. He told them to build castles, so they were licensed by him, royal castles. So he got lots of castles that he wouldn't have had otherwise, that he didn't have to pay for. So castles sprang up all over the place. But the other reason was so that the people that he was rewarding, his noblemen, he kept his promise. He gave them land and titles, as he said he would. But they couldn't their land wasn't all together, so it didn't form a power base. Because he'd seen how that worked in Normandy. He didn't want all the land in one place so that one nobleman or whichever would start challenging him. So that was very cunning. And of course, because they were on the move, they were acting as sort of his police. They were acting as his security men. They were checking up that there were no Anglo-Saxon rebellions, which of course there were. our ancestors, our Anglo-Saxon ancestors, did not settle down to Norman rule, not at all. It took many, many years before he felt secure. In fact, he probably never did feel secure. So he personally was very restless. He spent his time traveling, either hunting or on campaign, because he was still Duke of Normandy. So he had to go abroad to Normandy, he had to look after Normandy as well as England, and or traveling around this country, checking up on his noblemen who he didn't totally trust, just making sure that, you know, they never knew where he was going to pop up next. So like constant offsteading, schools, investigating. I mean, we could do with that a bit more now, actually, people being investigated. So he was abroad. He wasn't in this country when he had his accident. He was besieging the French town of Nantes, and they were burning buildings, and there were pieces of wood flying around, burning wood, brands they're called. And although horses were trained very well in those days to accept all sorts of unusual circumstances, William's horse on this occasion was sort of spooked by these, understandably so, his horses are nervous creatures and very sensible creatures, flying bits of red hot wood flying towards the poor horse, and it reared up. It was frightened, and it reared up. And in those days, saddles were very different from today. They were wooden, covered in leather, and a very high pommel at the front, and it stabbed into his tummy really, really hard. His tummy was huge, so his tummy was sort of touching where it shouldn't. It was sort of against this pommel, filling all the seat and everything, and it went into his tummy. And we realise now that it had given him huge internal injuries, rupturing parts of his intestine and possibly spleen, etc. I mean, obviously without X-rays and scans, we don't know exactly what his injuries were, but we know that it cost him his life. And he was in a great deal of pain, so we know he had internal injuries. And he died slowly and in great pain. And a lot of people have thought, well, certain right, because he had been a cruel ruler. He had done, apart from the cutting people's hands and feet off, which is a dreadful, dreadful punishment. And we'll go into this in more detail, but you probably remember hearing about the harrying of the North, that the North Country rebelled against Norman rule. When he became King of England, he faced many rebellions, and the North of England had rebelled against him, and their punishment was appalling. He ordered the North to be harried, which meant laid waste. That people would be killed, but also they would die slowly, because the order was that the Norman troops were to ride north. They were to set fire to the people's houses, so they got nowhere to live, and everything of value was to be taken. So all their food stores and their animals, all to be taken, and they were just to be driven out to die in the cold and the wet. You know, they could go and literally die in a ditch. It was a horrible, horrible punishment. And when Doomsday was published, you may very well remember this from school, many of the villages in the north had disappeared. They were registered, the name of the village was recorded, and how much it had been worth in the time of King Edward. And it was now worth nothing. And the word waste was written across it. Waste, meaning there's nothing there anymore. So what happened to the people? Well, if they were lucky, they might have been accepted by another village, but without land, that would have been a problem. Or they just wandered about and died. And that was an evil thing to have done, a wicked thing to have done. So, dying in pain, some people felt it was God's judgment. Dying slowly in pain, which is very much what he'd done to other people, dying slowly of starvation, was a fitting judgment, that God was judging him. And he felt the same, interestingly. On his deathbed, he had plenty of time to reflect. It took a long while for him to die. And he died probably of gangrene, of his internal organs going bad because they were so badly damaged, which is horrible. We don't wish this kind of death on anybody, but at the time, and he himself believed it was God's judgment on him for his cruel rule. And he had plenty of time to reflect. And because he was a good Christian, he had priests with him all the time and bishops, hearing how contrite he was and how he regretted the things he'd done, which we believe he really did regret what he'd done. And he gave offerings to many, many churches and monasteries and city and towns that he had besieged where he behaved badly and punished the people and very cruelly. And he gave money and founded monasteries and schools, etc., to try and prove how sorry he was. And he forgave his enemies and made a very pious and a very religious deathbed, and was praised by the church, of course, for this and the fact that he was so contrite and so sorry for the sins he committed, and named them. Didn't just sort of generalize, he actually named the places where he had behaved in a particularly cruel way. He left generous gifts to the church and monasteries that he'd founded. He forgave his enemies. And then, very dramatically, his funeral, which again you might remember. The guy that had been told to make the sarcophagus hadn't been given the proper measurements, and he hadn't factored in the king's enormous bulk, the fact that he was very overweight, corpulent, they kept saying, and he'd made a standard sarcophagus, stone sarcophagus. So when it came to actually putting the king into the sarcophagus, he didn't fit. They measured the length, but they hadn't measured the width and the depth. So they squashed him. It was not a good idea. So as they kind of squashed his body to fit it into this sarcophagus that wasn't wide enough or deep enough, he sort of exploded. He burst open, his stomach burst open, and all this, and the most horrible smell then pervaded the church. And it was so horrible, some people collapsed, other people raced for the door, presumably they hadn't got hankies in those days, but presumably with their arms over their noses because the stench was so absolutely dreadful. The funeral rites, which were just very hastily conducted then and concluded, it was sort of gabbled through by the poor clergy who had to stay by the coffin. But it was all, I mean, just so horrible and so just an awful way for this man of great pride and self-esteem, so degrading at the end. And again, people say this is God's judgment. You know, it's never happened before. We've never seen anything so awful happen. God's done it. God is not mocked. God is punishing him for all the dreadful things he's done to people. So the funeral rites were done in enormous haste. So that wasn't very dignified either. They just gabbled through, just to quick, let's get everybody out of the building. So what happened then? Well, a beautiful tomb encrusted with jewels was provided by his son, our second Norman king, William II, William Rufus, who was killed in the New Forest. But his tomb was never, the conqueror's tomb was never really left alone for all that long. In 1822, the tomb was opened, and many of the bones were discarded. Well, we don't quite know what happened to them. They seem to disappear. Whether people took them as souvenirs, we don't know.
1822.
Yeah. In 1860, the tomb was despoiled by a Calvinist mob seeking treasure. The scattered contents were buried under a new monument in 1642. Sorry, 1822 is wrong. Destroyed in the French Revolution and thrown into a river. So most of the bones disappeared during the French Revolution. So there's only one bone left, which has been buried with great dignity, as if it's a whole person, and it's got its own little mini tomb in the abbey which he founded, and that was opening as late as 1987. So there is a sort of little baby tomb suitable for a leg bone, because that's all that's left is femur. So again, people saying, well, you know, he caused a lot of trouble to a lot of people. He destroyed a lot of families. He brought misery and suffering. This is all part of the retribution. The fact that there is only that much left of him, a man of such pride and such self-esteem, that how are the mighty brought low? You know, it's a sort of like a biblical curse. And Martin's found pictures of his tomb at the church of Saint Etienne Abbey, and that's an abbey that he built, a huge abbey, which he built from royal funds, or duke funds. And Matilda of Flanders paid for a monastery to be built, a twin at the side, and that's where she's buried, and her tomb has survived intact. And Martin's found pictures of both the tombs. So next time we've got
Men's cathedral and women's cathedral.
yes, Man's Cathedral and Women's Cathedral. That's how it that was the idea. But again, treating his wife as an equal partner, which was so unusual in those days. You know, he does deserve brownie points for that he had a very unusually modern attitude to his wife and her rights and her dignity. He treated her as an equal partner, which was absolutely unheard of, absolutely amazing. So a very strange, well, not strange, but an unusual mixture of very good and admirable and very bad and dreadful and appalling, strange mixture, possibly caused by his childhood. Because we can work out a lot about people if we know what their background is, their backstory, how they've been damaged or improved or influenced or conditioned by their childhood experiences. And certainly his childhood experiences were so extreme that it ended up creating an extreme personality. You know, the savage cruelty and the extreme piety. You know, they kind of so contradictory. Next time, we're going to look at Norman England. What did the Conqueror actually do? What did William the Conqueror do for us? Like, what did the Romans do for us? Well, what did the Normans do for us? So it'll be castles and cathedrals, and very, very much, which you will all remember, the Domesday Survey, this amazing, absolutely amazing insight into life in this country in 1087. Absolutely extraordinary. That and the Bayeux Tapestry. We are so lucky in this country to have these two historical artifacts, so we can look into the past with confidence. Particularly the Domesday. You know, it's amazing primary source material, which is still being investigated, still producing students who are finding fresh material and fresh insights. Absolutely amazing. So we're going to do that next time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. Next time being the 6th of February already, into the next month. Just one interesting fact. We have one of our members joined us from Australia for this lecture we've just had. So as we go into the holiday season, don't forget to take your tablet with you, because if you've got internet where you're going, you can join us on a Monday morning. Nice to see you, David. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Bye, Judy. Bye, Martin.